For this hat, I used heavyweight corduroy and lined with cotton flannel. These two kinds of fabric make a really cute combination for a cold weather tulip hat, but there are a couple things to know that might be helpful to get a great result. And this is how it looks on me. You can download my tulip hat pattern for free from my website, madebysachi.com. It says tulip hat 2 because I modified the pattern a little since I published my original video. The second version of the hat is a bit narrower both in head circumference and brim. When you're using thick materials like heavyweight corduroy or wool, you want to add a little bit of width everywhere to account for the thickness of the fabric. Here I'm adding 1/8 of an inch everywhere, and then on the second thought, I decided 1/8 of an inch is a bit too much, so I decided to do more like 1/16 of an inch. I use 1/8 of an inch a lot for clothing, but this hat is made up with 6 pieces sewn together. That means 1/8 on both sides, which adds up to 1/4 of an inch for one piece times 6 for 6 pieces, which means I'll be adding 1.5 inch to the circumference. I thought half of that was probably appropriate. I kept 1/8 of an inch to the brim edge for the turnip cloth. The turnip cloth is a topic for another video, but to explain it simply about what applies here is that it's extra fabric for wrapping around the edge, so the lining fabric does not stick out. Corduroy fabric has nap, which is the direction the fiber of the fabric is laying. The direction which feels smoother will reflect the light more and appear lighter. The direction that feels rougher will appear darker. There is no right or wrong here, and you can use whichever direction you like, but the point is that you need to stick with the one direction that you choose. For the lining, I picked cotton flannel. It's hard to see in the video, but the wrong side looks slightly different from the right side of the fabric. But there is no direction. I decided to use the downward nap so the color will appear deeper. In the other videos of me making this tulip hat, I alternate the direction of the pattern to save fabric. Here I'm going to keep the pattern in one direction. I fold the pattern in half to find the grain of the fabric a little bit easier. Line up the folded edge along one of the vertical lines. Open the pattern and trace around it. And repeat this 6 times. Cut on the inside edge of the choke line. This way the cut fabric pieces will be the exact copies of the paper pattern. If you cut this way, your choke line does not need to be super thin to be accurate. Now you cut out 6 pieces of the exact same pattern in the same direction and on grain. For the flannel lining, the pattern needs to be adjusted a little again. It's very simple, just cut off the extra width you just added for the corduroy fabric and cut exactly on the outer edge of the pattern. For this fabric, I'm cutting with double layers. Since this is lining fabric and it's going to be inside, there's no need to be extra accurate, but I measure the distance from the savage edge of the fabric and the grain line arrow to make sure the arrow is parallel to the savage edge. I thought I could just pin the pattern down and cut around it, but I noticed that I was shaving off a little bit from the pattern with my scissors. If I do this every time I cut out a piece, I would eventually end up with a smaller pattern, so I decided that the tracing is the better way to go. First, you make 2 sets of 3 pieces sewn together. Once you sew one seam, open up the seam and stitch down the seam allowances on both sides. This might feel counterintuitive to some people, but when you are stitching down the seam allowances, do it from the right side. The sewing machine always feeds the bottom fabric slightly more than the top fabric, so doing it this way helps the seam allowances to be pushed into the seam more easily. Now you do the same thing with the lining. For the lining, when you connect the 2 big pieces together, leave an opening on one side about 4 inches. When you come to the first marking, do the back stitch and skip the opening and start sewing from the second marking. Place the outer piece on the lining piece, both right sides facing each other. Align the seams. The outer piece is slightly bigger than the lining, so put the outer piece on the bottom to help with feeding the fabric. You might have to pull tight on the lining to match the vertical seams. Through the opening, understitch the seam allowances to the lining. That means you push all the seam allowances to the right and stitch close to the previous seam on the lining. This is a bit tricky part, but if you do it slowly, 1 inch or so at a time, it is completely doable. Once you do it all the way around, flip the hat right side out. You can hand stitch the opening closed for a nicer finish, but I usually machine stitch like this. Nobody is going to see it, and the seam doesn't bother me when I'm wearing the hat. Here is an example of the turnip cloth adjustment. Since we made the outer piece longer, the outer piece fabric is wrapping around the edge, making it a nicer finish. Steaming and shaping is the final step. Tailor's hem is very useful for finishing homemade hats. And my hat is complete. This is a very quick and satisfying project, so I hope you give it a try.